industrial hubs, but they are also the most populous provinces, and therefore see a deep erosion of our base. And then, of course, the third economic hub of our country, Western Cape, remains in the hand of the DA. The ANC won 5 provinces with an outright majority. That's Eastern Cape, Free State, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and Northwest, with varied degrees of majority. The lowest in Mpumalanga, where we just managed to receive just over 51%. Now, what did this then mean in relation to what we call the building of our national democratic society? To ask the question how we got to this point. How is it that a movement that for 30 years governed received a majority as high as 57% in 2019, in a period of 5 years, only managed to receive 40%, as we did in the 2024 elections. And the analysis, and of course, there's a process of making the assessment within the National Executive Committee, as well as all of our structures across the country, to look at what is it. The first one is that something that has been identified as way back as 2000, the question about the impact of being in government to the ANC, and we call it the sense of incumbency, reflected in the link between the ANC and the people, the quality of our branches and cadership, work amongst the motor forces, a fractured trade union movement with the split in COSATU. And that was overall manifested in the decline in the registration, decline in turnout, as well as the ANC's electoral decline. And then, of course, the challenge of corruption and state capture that we face over a long period. And therefore, since 2017, the 54th National Conference, the emphasis on the need for the ANC's renewal, internal renewal, its ideational renewal, its organizational renewal, its ethical renewal to turn this around. So that's the first issue. And this is not something that happened over the last 5 years. It's something that, as I said, have been in the making for quite a while. The second one is around meeting basic needs and the social wage, that since 1994, there has been progress in ensuring that progressively we extend basic services, the evolution of our democratic, non-racial, non-sexist institutions, and the meeting of basic needs as part of the war on poverty. However, we tended to have a delivery rather than a developmental approach, with poor integrated planning, weak and effective local government, and often reproducing apartheid spatial patterns, poor maintenance and investment in bulk infrastructure in the context of a fast-growing population, as well as rapid urbanization. The third area that contributed to where we are now is around economic transformation, that our broad economic policy objective since 1994 has been a focus on growth and job creation. However, within the context of macroeconomic policy that emphasized stability, we had from the onset set a target of growth of between 5% and 6% in order to grow the labor market, but only during one period, 1999 to 2008, achieve an average of 4%. And then since then, growth has been particularly pedestrian, and at points negative growth, and together with the COVID shock has resulted in crisis level of high unemployment, and therefore for the first time we're beginning to see increase in poverty, as well as such other indicators as increase in hunger, as well as inequality. Towards the 10-year review of government in 2004 already warned at the time that if all indicators were continue along the same trajectory, especially in respect of the dynamics of economic inclusion and exclusion, we could soon reach a point where the negatives start to overwhelm the positive. And then, of course, the other factor that impact on where we are at the moment, and the fact that we saw the decline of the ANC to below 40, to below 50% is then, of course, the era of corruption and state capture, the impact on the capacity of the state and institutions, the responsiveness to citizen issues, and the resultant lack of trust of citizens in the ANC and government, and the fact that although measures have been instituted both in government as well as in the ANC to address these issues, it hasn't been fast enough to be able to decisively say to the population, particularly the motor forces, that yes, we have made a decisive break with the past and that we are now on a route towards renewal and that it's irreversible. So those are some of the, as I say, some of the causes that have brought us to this moment. But I think that, as I said before, that that is still a process that we are looking at as we delve deeper into the election results. But I think that there's broad agreement that these are amongst the reasons for why we have. So this is the national elections results. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parties that constitute about just over 85% of all of the sealed seats in the National Assembly. You have a total of 18 parties who are represented in the National Assembly. So the ANC is there in green at 159 seats, the Democratic Alliance in yellow at 87, the MK Party at 58 seats, who's the red? Oh, EFF in red of 39 seats in Carter Freedom Party. And then you have other parties, the Patriotic Alliance 9, Actions in South Africa, and the Freedom Front plus 6 each, and up to parties that only managed to gain one seat. So that's the part of it. I think that part of the reality, therefore, of the 2024 elections result has been that no single party have been able to form a government on its own because nobody has received more than 50% of the votes. The second part of the elections result is the fact that the ANC received in 5 provinces. Again, received a majority in Limpopo, 73%, with the EFF as the official opposition, followed by the DA. In the Eastern Cape, the ANC achieved 62%, the DA as the official opposition. In Northwest, the ANC 57.7%, the EFF as the official opposition. Free State, the ANC just over 51%, with the DA as the official opposition. And in Mpumalanga, we're also just about 51%, with MKP as the official opposition. And then
Comrade Phoebe, you are muted. Let me ask you to unmute. I don't know what happened there.
Sorry, I also don't know what happened. Okay, so what I was saying, comrades, is that the previous slide focused on the provinces that had where the ANC received the majority. This slide look at provinces where we also didn't get an outright majority. So Gauteng, the ANC 34.7%, the DA 27.4%, the EFF 12%. So the Gauteng provincial results show quite a lot of fragmentation. KZN, MKP 45%, IFP 18%, and we had in third place at about 17%. The Western Cape, the DA won outright, the ANC quite a significant shift reduction from what we got in 2019 with about 20%, the PA 7.8%. And then in Northern Cape, we just got below 49%, and in seats that resulted in 50%. So not only were we not able to form a national government on our own at a national level, but also in 4 of the province, Gauteng, KZN, Western Cape, not Western Cape, Gauteng, KZN, and Northern Cape. So those are the three provinces. And then, of course, in the Western Cape, the DA won an outright majority. So what did we then do? And as the result came out on the, I think, 31st of May, the 1st of June, the officials then started an engagement to look at the different options in the context of the results as they came out. And having come to the conclusion that the results represent a significant setback, the part of what we need to do is to look at how do we make sure that firstly look at tackling the underlying objective and subject factors, and will come back to that much later. But secondly, the immediate question that faced us was, how do we, in the context of these results, safeguard a progressive socio-economic transformation agenda, national unity, peace, and stability for the country? And secondly, how do we ensure that we continue to exercise political powers to defend the gains of the 30 years of freedom, as well as create space for advancing the creation of a non-racial, non-sexist, united, democratic, and prosperous South Africa, even in the conditions of unfavorable electoral outcomes? The National Executive Committee convened on the 6th of June and considered a range of options, narrowed it down to 3. But in the mains, these were the options that were considered. The first one is, of course, that if you don't get a majority, one of the things to consider is a grand coalition. And that would mean the ANC coming together with one or two parties that have received a substantial electoral support. And comrades, remember that slide that I put that shows the allocation of seats. That meant, given how parties have received seats in terms of the election results, that mean either with the MKP, EFF, the DA, or the IFP. And the advantages of a grand coalition is that they offer some form of stability because there are fewer parties. And if there's agreement about the direction of the country, there's agreement about how the parties should work together, it can mean some measure of stability. However, and this has been in our experience in local government, also mean that often that stability comes at the behest of one partner party, which can force concessions that's not in line with either the interests of the country and the people. And the NEC therefore ruled out a grand coalition with either the DA or the EFF and MKP, acknowledging that although with different ideological orientation, what these parties have in common is the common commitment to liquidate the ANC. And we've seen that before the elections, but also in their engagements with the parties, they were fairly upfront about what part of their objectives are. The second consideration was to look at a minority government. And what happened is that a party without a majority form a minority government. So you form a minority ANC government and have agreements with other parties to make sure that nobody, through what they call supply and confidence agreement, that parties don't have vote of no confidence against you, but also that they support your budgets and other major program. The problem with minority government is that they're often unstable because parties can wake up the next morning and decide that actually we don't like you, so we're going to have a vote of no confidence, or we're not going to vote for your budget, and you then have those kind of problems. And I think that both 1 and 2, the question about instability, given the experience from the local government sphere of government where you didn't have outright majorities, meant that these two options were having their difficulties. The third option that the NEC considered was a government of national unity, and it's a government formed by parties that agree to cooperate, even if they have many policy or ideological differences, in order to resolve specific national challenges, conflicts, or crises in a society at a given moment. And the nature and composition depends on the conditions. We have experience of government of national unity of a particular type in 1994, Côte d'Ivoire, for quite a long period after the elections, violence in around 2008 had one, Kenya, Northern Ireland, and other places. So there are examples of other places where at a particular moment, a government of national unity is seen as a way forward. The fourth one was that given the fact that we didn't get a majority, the ANC also had the option of going into opposition and allow the other parties to try and form a government. And it was ruled out because it will not be possible we've seen the difficulty of addressing the aspirations and needs of people from the opposition. And that in fact, the very essence of the National Democratic Revolution, if the ANC took this option, would have been in danger, because without state power, the transformation of South Africa will not be realized, and that you will be handing it over to forces that may not necessarily be interested in the kind of thoroughgoing transformation and resolution of the historical injustices which form the core of what the ANC is about. So the National Executive looked at the risks and opportunities, the pros and cons of each of these options, and weighed them up, and then came to the conclusion that unanimous, that we need to look at a new type of a government of national unity with unique characteristics that's adjusted to and appropriate to the 2024 national challenges and tasks, and I'll come to that. That this is the best option to move the country forward, that none of the coalition government models explored will enable us to achieve the immediate goals of uniting society, that either one of grand coalitions, whether it's with MKP or whether it's a grand coalition with a DA, would further contribute towards the national schism that we've seen so prevalent in the lead up to the elections and during the election campaign, and that that it won't enable us to achieve the immediate goal of uniting society in search of a common national agenda that will benefit the people as a whole. The NEC also further said that in our approach towards the GNU, that we need to acknowledge that it will be a government that's made up of different parties that agree to work together for the sake of the country, understanding that bringing different parties to work together will not be an easy task. Some of them want to liquidate the NDR, while others want to liquidate the ANC itself. However, all the parties know that it will be difficult to move the country forward without the ANC. And once again, the ANC had the responsibility to occupy that leadership role in society and embark on the difficult role of trying to build consensus about how do we then form a government. The NEC appointed a negotiations team led by the Secretary General, and gave the mandate to develop clear guiding principles, a minimum program and modalities of the government of national unity, as well as to talk to all parties that receive seats in the national parliament. And then in addition to that, the NEC also agreed in principle with a proposal for a national dialogue, with the objective to come up with some form of national consensus and national social compact on what should be the key task to address the basic contradictions that our society face and basic problems that we face of inequality, poverty, and unemployment. A new kind of conference for a democratic future, where we acknowledge that we've made advances towards the creation of a democratic society. We've made advances towards a social wage, even though there are challenges of qualities, but that the question about how do you build an inclusive economy, how do you grow your economy, how do you expand the productive forces of your economy through industrialization, that those issues need broad consensus within our society, among civil society, labor, business, government, and all sectors of society, and hence the proposal for a national dialogue. And the idea of a government of national unity and a national dialogue were seen as two sides of the same coin. The other issue that the NEC also looked at was some of the guiding principles which the NEC has adopted last year when it adopted its coalition framework as instructed by the 55th National Congress. the fact that coalitions must be based on common minimum programs that focus on measurable national development, so that at the end of the day, it's not a backroom deal, but something where we clearly can say to the population, these are the things that we want to achieve in terms of employment. These are the issues, targets that we set in terms of transformation, in terms of basic services, on land reform, on education, on health, so that it's something that's transparent, but a common minimum program that the population and different sectors, civil society can then hold, as well as ourselves as the ANC can hold our government of national unity accountable. And then some of the shared values: stability, accountability, transparency, ethic and integrity, community participation, good governance, respect for the Constitution and the rule of law, social justice and equity, human dignity, non-racialism, non-sexism, and the overall vision of South Africa as a united, democratic, non-racial, non-sexist and prosperous society as a shared goal, as encapsulated in the Constitution. So those are part of the guiding principles. I'm not going to go into that, but those also guided our approach towards the government of national unity. Some of the other issues include the fact that that unlike a strict coalition that tend to be between, a few parties or with one other partner, the GNU is a more inclusive government that brings together different parties, including those that you disagree with ideological, to put the interests of the nation and countries first. And the approach of the NEC was that we need to talk to all parties. As I said, there were 18 parties that were, there are 18 parties that's represented, including the ANC, and therefore the ANC sought to talk to all of them in the interest of inclusivity, respect for the electoral outcomes, as well as national incomes, the national interests, to ensure that that these issues then inform our approach towards that. The ANC in its negotiations also had certain red lines that we will not allow a government of national unity to be used for reversing the gains made over the last 30 years, including undermining our constitutional democracy, the fundamental socio-economic transformation agenda, the Constitution, as well as human rights enshrined in it, that we won't allow the undermining of South Africa's progressive foreign policies, as well as its posture in the continent and the world, and then, of course, our commitment towards the African agenda. And we therefore proceeded on that principles to then engage that. Amongst the other, so very briefly about the process, there was a process of talking to all of the parties. We had with most parties at least 1 or 2 meetings. The larger parties more than 2 meetings. The ANC team drafted a statement of intent, which were then given to the different parties for inputs, that has foundational principles that should underpin the government of national unity. And I spoke about them. They contained in our coalition framework. But in addition to that, also a minimum program for the 7th administration, the commitment towards inclusive growth, workers' rights, social justice and equity and redress, land reform, quality basic services, etc. That these statement of intent then forms the foundation for participation in the government of national unity. And the invitation was extended to all political parties represented in Parliament. Initially, there was a proposal for some form of threshold, like we had in 1994, where you then say that, okay, a party, in order to become part of the government of national unity, should have 3%, for argument's sake, of seats, or 3% of the votes. But that would mean that you would exclude quite a number of parties, just given the configuration of the seats in Parliament. And that is why we approach it in this way, to say that there shouldn't be a threshold, but the minimum should be that parties accept the foundational principles, as well as the minimum program for the 7th administration, and then of course the modalities, but also the principle that the cooperation would be across both the executive as well as the legislative arms of the state. So not just in cabinet, but also cooperation in government to make sure that we build a parliament and legislatures where oversight is strengthened, as well as the legislative powers of parliament and the legislatures strengthened.
Comrade Phoebe, I think we're losing you a bit. Comrade Phoebe, I'm not sure if I'm the only one who can't hear you. If I'm the only one, can please someone indicate in the chat group, in the chat room, if they can hear Comrade Phoebe? Oh, I think we lost her. I think we lost her. It must have been a network issue. Hopefully she'll be able to join us to complete her presentation. But I think so far we have gotten the gist of what she was saying, giving us a historical background of how we got here and some of the early indicators that this movement was actually somewhat inevitable, and also taking us through the process of negotiations as to what informed the decision that was taken, and how did those negotiations go as well. So I think that's a full background as to why are we here. Hopefully she can rejoin us some point for you to conclude her presentation. But meanwhile, can you please just take those notes, get them ready? Then in the question and answer session, we should be able to pose some questions to her. But I'm going to move swiftly to Comrade Mpotladi to also give us his presentation on his input about the GNU. I'll just read out his bio shortly so that we can hear from him. So Mpotladi is a local government practitioner in strategy and research. He holds a National School of Government, New Gela, that is the certificate for senior administrators. Also, the Hague Academy for Local Government Certificates, and he has recently published a chapter from his PhD, which he's busy with in political studies, which focuses on enhancing governance and organizational performance through applied political science. Comrade Mpo integrates a broad spectrum of political studies into practical settings, focusing on governance reform, policy analysis, and integrated planning. He has also just completed a key research project on the impact of coalitions on governance in Johannesburg, demonstrating his expertise in handling complex political dynamics. He is also a member of the Regina Nzo branch, Ward 23 in Greater Johannesburg region. So that is who Comrade Mpotladi is. But before I allow you, Comrade Mpo, Comrade Phoebe is back. Can we just allow her some time to conclude her input, and then we will go straight to you after she comes through. Comrade Phoebe, welcome back.
Okay, my apologies, comrades.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can conclude where you left off.
Okay, so what I'll do is to just say that has been the broad approach, and eventually, by the 30th of June, the process were concluded with 11 parties that form part of the Government of National Unity that by then have signed the statement of intent with the ANC. We've also, in the 3 provinces where we didn't get an outright majority, also formed government. In the Northern Cape, the ANC formed a government with the support of the PA and the Freedom Front plus the DA and EFF voted against the formation of the ANC government there. In KZN, after MKP failed to form a government, the second largest party, IFP, led the formation of a government of provincial unity and invited the ANC to be part of it. And then in Gauteng, a minority government of provincial unity was formed, led by the ANC with the inclusion of Rise Mzansi, which other parties, the PA as well as the IFP. Comrades, the main issues in terms of the implications for the ANC is, of course, the question about how do we then ensure that in the current context where we're not governing alone, how do we then make sure that we keep on advancing transformation in our country and address the key issues? And in that regard, the approach that we followed is to look at some of the key tasks. Firstly, to be able to make sure that our minimum program of action of the Government of National Unity focus on the central challenges facing South Africa, which is addressing unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And in order to do that, we need to ensure that we improve the delivery of basic services, that we invest in people, particularly education and health, and improve the quality of education outcomes, that we need to a renewed focus on growth and employment and economic transformation, building the productive capacity of the state, the focus on industrialization, infrastructure development, as well as opportunity presented by the African Continental Free Trade Areas, accelerated land reform, strengthening SOEs, as well as making sure that macroeconomic policy that support national development goals. And then, of course, the building of a developmental state that is ethical, that involves citizens, that rebuild trust, that's responsive as well as effective, and work towards universal access, quality basic services, investment in people. The approach that the ANC has followed is through its manifesto, and therefore the Government of National Unity Minimum Program, is to ensure that we have an outcomes framework where we look at every single one of the commitments that we've made around employment, around industrialization, around investment in people, and the priorities that we set, and to then be able to monitor them as we set in our manifesto and on a 6-month basis, on an annual basis, to be able to publicly report on how far we've come with each and every one of the commitments that we've made within our manifesto, and therefore the minimum program that we're taking into the Government of National Unity. And then, of course, the national dialogue that I spoke to about, critical towards building consensus.
Comrade Phoebe,
Yeah.
I'm sorry for interrupting. Can you please share your screen again? I think people were following you better with the slides on. I'm not sure how far you are from concluding, but if you can just share those.
This is the final point, and I'll share the key task. And then the final issue is, in addition to the national dialogue, is then ANC renewal. And this is something that is urgent, that's a priority, about making sure that we have the appropriate organizational structures at this long overdue and systems, investing in the capabilities of our members and leaders and our deployees, our relationship with people, the ethics and integrity of the ANC, as well as ideational renewal about what does the current moment in 2024, for example, mean with our relationship with the motive forces? What does it mean for the building of a national democratic society, as well as what does it mean in the geopolitics of the continent, as well as the geopolitics of the world that we face away? And all of those tasks are critical. And therefore, as we proceed forward, this is the key things that whether it's the ANC branches or ANC regions or provinces or the alliance are concerned about, making sure that we continue to defend the gains of the last 30 years, address the mistakes, but also able to tackle the issues that people face, the questions around economy, costs of living, jobs, basic services, as well as rebuild the trust of the population in public institutions. Thank you very much, Comrade Chair.
Thank you very much, Comrade Phoebe. I had already extended our gratitude for this detailed presentation, which covers the very important developments that led to this decision. I would kindly appreciate it if you were to share the presentation with us so that we can share it with the participants, because most of the participants here are actually active members of the ANC. Some of them are leaders of branches and structures at different levels, and surely they would benefit from the content of that presentation. So without wasting any time, comrades, I'll call Kedam Potladi to give us his presentation. I've already introduced him. And then after him, we'll have a question and answer session. We will pose questions to both Comrade Phoebe and Comrade Mpho. Please note that you need to rename your gadgets so that we can note you in the question and answer session. So I think it's important that while Mpho is giving his presentation, if your gadget is not named properly, please just rename it. You're allowed to do that. Thank you very much. Comrade Mpho, the floor is yours. Please unmute Mpho.
Thank you so much, Comrade Gifense and Comrade Phoebe. Thank you so much for that background. Maybe let me just ask to share my screen as well. If you could just enable me to do that, Comrade Gifense. Thank you. Right. Can we all see it? Can you see it, Gifense? Chair of the session, can you see the presentation? You can just indicate to me and then, yeah, I'm good to go. Or maybe in the chat. I'll assume that my presentation is okay. Thank you so much in the chat there. I see you, comrades. I appreciate that. So yeah, thank you for the engagement, Comrade Phoebe. That background was quite helpful. And I think you covered a lot of aspects of what I would be touching on. I think my presentation would be a bit more broader in a sense, in the sense that I'd be giving a more theoretical outlining of the recent observations. Then my screen just disappeared again, Giffens. I don't know what happened. You took host powers.
I'm sorry, Comrade Mpho. I had made you host, so now I can't, instead of making you co-host, so you can share again. So okay. That's why when you asked if I can see the screen, I can't unmute now.
Oh, okay. Let me just share again. Okay, and then just a sec. Okay, so I'll be essentially setting the scene, trying very hard not to duplicate what Comrade Phoebe has already said. I'll also speak to what this moment of fundamental consequence is. I'll then speak on the empty place of power, which is a theoretical framing that I actually that informs my research and my PhD on coalitions currently. Then I'll speak about the empty place of power and locating it in strategy and tactics. Then I'll also talk to the ontology of the government of national unity. What is its inherent makeup? And then I'll talk about what strategy and tactics calls the comprador bourgeoisie. But it's an analysis on this comprador bourgeoisie moment and reflecting on the premier and our chairperson, Comrade Panyaza Sufi, essentially wearing a T-shirt that said, "Killing Chris Hani again," or "Let's avoid killing Chris Hani again." So it's essentially framed as a question in this discussion. And I'll also talk to challenges with coalitions and essentially just touching also maybe on what Comrade Phoebe has also spoken about. Then I'll suggest some interventions and mechanisms, and then we'll have a discussion about the 2026 local government elections and what we can do to secure some kind of semblance, rather maybe of victory, licking our wounds, and obviously, hopefully, emerging there better than we are now. So, with regard to the global aspect of where we find ourselves in this moment, there are dozens of countries that are going to elections in 2024, and in total, 40% of the planet's population is expected to cast ballots in 50 national contests. India has been governed for nearly 10 years by a Hindu nationalist prime minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, and he just secured a third term, although he's just entered into a coalition himself. In Russia, Putin secured victory in entering his fifth term as president, and he secured an overwhelming 88% majority, although we know Russia is an autocratic state. Elections are held there for the sake of, I think from where I'm sitting, continuity in terms of the status quo of political parties that are essentially there, but also to have some form of accountability within the political parties that constitute that autocratic state. But Putin essentially emerges victorious because of his management of that entire situation. He's got a firm grip of Russia. We all know that. In the UK, Rishi Sunak of the Conservative Party just experienced a very upsetting loss, almost 2/3 to the Labour Party, and that just shows you how the Labour Party or the people of the United Kingdom are really upset or hurtful with Rishi Sunak completely, and being conservative or framing themselves as a conservative nation. And we also have Iceland, which is considered one of the most democratic countries that are heading to the polls, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, which does a study on democratic index, according to how democratic particular countries are. And then we also have Senegal here in Africa, where Diomaye Faye emerged with a 54% electoral victory. And what's interesting in Senegal is that this man was literally fresh out of prison to emerge as a leader and president of Senegal. We also have France, which is going to elections today. They're having their second round of elections, but things are not looking good for Emmanuel Macron in the sense that the French are seemingly looking for a conservative alternative. And what's interesting there, you can contrast it with the Brits. So on the one hand, the Brits don't want conservatism, but on the other hand, the French do want conservatism. So it's really interesting, and I'll frame this in terms of the empty place of power, which I'll talk about later. And then we also have Turkey, which is going to elections for the first time in over 20 years, and the incumbent president, Mr. Recep Tayyip, is set for a huge defeat as well against the pro-Palestinian candidate, Mr. Ekrem Imamoglu. So this background is important to show that different countries are navigating the electoral processes. We're not operating here in a silo. And like us, they also have to navigate the outcomes of these elections. And for us to frame South Africa's elections within this broader international context, it sets the stage for us to compare our political climate with these international trends to sort of find and devise potential lessons. Globally, we should also recognize that democracies are either being reinforced or undermined, and the GNU occurs in the global context. And the discussion we're having here is how this GNU measures up in the domestic, but also a global context when it comes to democracy. So Comrade Phoebe already highlighted the colorful spectrum of what led up to our decline in support and our electoral demise. We know that 2024, that slogan of 2024 is our 1994, dealt a huge blow on us, and the elections while they were sufficiently free and fair, there were vote rigging allegations. There was a 2-hour shutdown of the system at the Results Operations Center. The DA invited the ANC, invited rather the USA to observe our elections. The DA also burnt the flag. There were also threats of violence in South Africa. So it was a very, very tense moment. But immediately after the results were clear, the Moonshot Pact was abandoned. The EFF held some peculiar press briefing, and coalition talks were set in motion even at that stage. So we know even at that rock moment when results were being tallied, that famous saying of comrades and other political parties saying, no, it's still early days. These VDs haven't been counted, just to suggest that there was still some hope. But even that was crushed by 2024 is our 1994, So with the GNU, it seems our leaders have taken this 2024 as our 1994 moment quite literally, because GNU follows suit in terms of its associations with the 1994 GNU, which Comrade Phoebe elaborated on earlier. So in the literature on talks about talks, they actually constitute round one of 2 rounds, and it's essentially they first get to know if they'll be able to work together, touching base, quoting one another, so to speak. And then once this is done, then move on to the next round and then agree on modalities. And this is where that NEC moment of suspense is essentially where we all just focused on it, and all eyes were just really fixed on Birchwood. Even ANC members were focused on Birchwood. It's one of the longest days in South Africa's recent history, what was happening at Birchwood, and really even leaks from comrades were minimal. We're expecting to see some drama from that NEC that Comrade Phoebe spoke about. But for me, what this told me is that it's an affirmation that the ANC is a leader of society, and this is echoing what Thabo Mbeki says about the ANC being too big to fail. The discourse is now about fewer but better. This discourse of fewer but better is gaining more and more traction as the chaff and the weeds of members are leaving the ANC. Some are staying with their own agendas, but I'll touch on that later. And then the national dialogue, which Comrade Phoebe spoke about, is also adopted here as a resolution. The NEC gives a go-ahead also to negotiate with political parties. And importantly, this is the moment where we're introduced to the idea of the fundamental moment of consequence, which is the theme of this webinar that we're having. It's a South African-facing statement in general, but it's also a voter-facing statement in particular. And this is why. So when we talk about what this moment of fundamental consequence is, we need to understand that most liberation parties only last about 30 years in the African context. And in 2022, we defined the ANC as being in an existential crisis. And this was due to our performance in the local government elections of 2021, losing a bunch of metros, a lot of metros where we held power, all of a sudden became hung municipalities. So the author in one Mkhabulo policy document says, existential, not so much that the ANC may cease to exist, so this existential crisis, but that its historic role in the South African polity, its unity of purpose, values, and standing amongst the people have been battered to such an extent that its very character as the people's movement and agent of change is under mortal threat. And it's a culmination, in essence, of 2 problems that this one author identifies. On the one hand, we know that as the ANC, we have been inward-looking, and problem statement number 2, the ANC was and is losing credibility and trust due to corruption, as well as state capture, which Comrade Phoebe already spoke about. And the ANC Veterans League also have a complimentary document on the ANC's renewal. And it says that the ANC attracted into its ranks people who were characterized as opportunists as well as careerists. So in terms of this 30-year period, while the duration may vary, the trend does suggest that 30 years is that mark where significant hurdles in sustaining power and legitimacy tend to dwindle in the long term. So disciplinary mechanisms in the ANC are also voluntary. Step aside is a voluntary thing. And we've created a culture in the ANC of nursing wrongdoing. President Motlanthe also says post-Mangaung that the internal crisis must reach its apex first. He says, I think it will be self-delusion to believe it's something that can self-correct. It has to get worse first. This is what the former president said. And could this moment be the culmination of this apex moment that Comrade Kgalema is talking about? This crisis reaching its apex has culminated into where we are now. It's a question. Meanwhile, we're also confronted with the weak opposition. Everything is framed in relation to the ANC. It's as if all opposition parties, not only the MK party, want to fix the ANC. So herein lies self-correction. Civil society, NGOs, voters, Chapter 9 institutions, all of them, and opposition parties, all of them, they will not fix the ANC. Opposition parties are saying they'd rather work with the ANC than to fix the ANC because it's an impossible thing to do. The ANC needs to self-correct. This election effectively gave the entire opposition enough muscle to remove the ANC from power, but they chose not to. So the ANC can't fix itself from outside. We shouldn't allow things to get any worse than this, though. That's the fundamental moment of consequence. That's the alarm bell that's this moment should be ringing to us. And it requires us to recognize finally that power is not guaranteed, because it's an indictment against the ANC that we failed to be an agent for change that always seeks to act in the best interests of people. We acted in the interests of ourselves. So I'm introducing democratic theory here to help us make more sense of this moment of fundamental consequence. And I'll be talking about the theory of the empty place of power by Claude Lefort, who's a French theorist in politics. And he essentially argues that no grouping should permanently hold the place of power in a democracy, no particular grouping. And countries on the right in this image are ranked here in terms of their level of openness, and that's the embrace of the essentially the empty place of power. And they're ranked according to Economist Intelligence Unit and Democracy Index and Freedom House's Global Freedom Scores, which classifies them as full democracies on a scale of 0 to 100. We can see that India's gets a 66, and India's a flawed democracy. The United States is a bit higher at 83. And then we also have Pakistan at 37 in terms of its level of openness or embracing democracy. And Lefort does recognize that some societies will choose a system where the place of power is less empty. So there are regimes that tend to be more authoritarian and totalitarian in their nature. This is based on the will of the people as well. So the philosophy of the empty place of power is based on the political as the ontology of the social. And the political is framed as the ontology, meaning the status or the state of being of any society is political in its nature, which is inherently a recognition of the field of interrogation being constantly alive, constantly behaving, and that's us essentially constantly questioning and disagreeing as well on how things should unfold. And politics are then that the ingredients, and they constitute the ingredients and the discussions and those disagreements as the ontic form. So really this theory is the basis of coalitions. All markers of certitude have been removed. In other words, what are markers of certitude? We know that majority rule determines who governs, but in this instance, as a marker of certitude, that majority rule is gone. Small parties are holding powerful positions. If not, their bargaining has increased. And then we have people from the right or parties from the right voting with the left, and parties from the left voting with the right, and vice versa. So it's essentially a theory about the destruction of the king's body. And the king in ancient history was known as the holder of power. The place of power was instituted in the king. So this is from the Machiavellian concept of the prince. So democracy essentially is about the destruction of the body of the king in very, very simple terms. And this theory is essentially about political forms of framing modern society. And it's important to make the disclaimer that this theory may not apply to archaic society. And this is perhaps where Lefort is lacking, or off-grid communities or nomads that move from one place to another. But it's essentially about unpacking the fundamentals of democracy and access to political rights as well as civil liberties, according to this index of democracy in this image here. So now we need to also now apply this theory in a very, very literal sense. So we know that, as I've just explained, that the idea of removing markers of certitude, it applies when we think of a majority determining executive power. In some instances, it may, but Johannesburg has taught us that small parties can wield significant power, and majority rule is not necessarily a guarantee, as I've just mentioned. So what the national vote told us is that many things, it told us many things, but primarily that, as what Comrade Ndu, the Chief Whip, told us, as well as Comrade Phoebe earlier, that a decisive majority is not something that we got, and it's one example of the practicalities of the empty place of power. So Mistra's 2021 publication, Marriages of Inconvenience, also asserts the non-linearity of party politics in the pursuit of stable coalitions in South Africa. And I also spoke earlier about how the talks were already set in motion. And importantly, we are still talking here about the genesis of the government of national unity in terms of the voter market share in this year's general election and elections as the moment of universal suffrage that enable any society to break itself apart as well as reconstitute itself. And what I mean quite literally here is that the ANC, the MK, the EFF, based on this graphic, with their 273 seats, which amounts to 68.3%, which quite literally is beyond the 2/3 mark, South Africa can, at a minimum, amend the constitution, or at a maximum, become an authoritarian state, should it wish to do so. Just by looking at this picture here, we can literally tip the scales of the form of society that we want for ourselves. So we also lost our majority in 3 more provinces, the Northern Cape, the KZN, and Gauteng. And Comrade Phoebe has already detailed the numbers, but KZN is probably significant because it constitutes a 37% decline from 2019 to 2024, and this is fundamentally due to the MK. It's the most telling province about a former president of a political party forming a breakaway political party. And one factor, and this is certainly not the main factor here, that led to this, is the fact that the monarch of KZN, of the Zulu monarch, literally decampaigned the ANC on the eve of the elections, literally saying, we'll fight them at the ballot boxes. So what KZN, the picture of these seats, is telling us that we have a clear sense of this non-linearity and the force powers contingency, which means that he's concerned about the realm of the uncertain. And here I'm essentially talking about how power is essentially hanging the balance of the National Freedom Party, quite literally, with their 1 seat. And this is because there's a 50-50 split between the GNU or GPU signatories and the rest. So we have to be hopeful that the NFP is happy with whatever with that social development portfolio that we've given them, or the leader of the IFP has given them as the premier. And then coming to Gauteng, and this picture in Gauteng is quite depressing, but fortunately, there are 2 things that are keeping Comrade Panyaza safe from a vote of no confidence. Number 1, he's possibly seen as independent and progressive by the MK as well as the EFF. So the 3 of these political parties together will constitute 47%, or 47 seats rather. So that's good. And then we also have the DA. Number 2, the DA is isolated in Gauteng. We know that the Moonshot Pact failed. So that's the IFP and the VF Plus. So the IFP and VF Plus are also GNU members. And then in terms of Action SA would need to be wooed by the DA to sort of constitute some kind of coalition there. But the DA is arrogant. They won't go back to Action SA to woo them. And between the DA, the VF Freedom Front Plus, we're ruling out IFP in this one because IFP have a province. They've been given KZN, and Action SA, they only constitute 27 seats. So that's another reason why Banyaza is safe. But these seats don't necessarily guarantee uniformity, which is why Comrade Lwazi in the chat speaks about how budgets and other legislation will be passed in this context. So there'll also be a lot of negotiation, but unfortunately with coalitions, these things take so much time. So we're going to be compromising a lot. We're seeing a lot of compromise of operations in Gauteng, unfortunately, until we're seeing Comrade Banyaza continuously saying the door is still open for coalitions for the DA. So yeah, we'll see what happens there. So in terms of the empty place of power and strategy and tactics, really, I wanted here to just contrast our situation with what's happening in West Africa. And military leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have held a newly signed treaty as a step towards greater integration between the three countries. In the latest showing of the shift away from traditional regional as well as Western allies, for us, we're criticized as moving in a direction that's counter to this, and we are therefore in bed with the colonizers. So we need to then think about, or the ANC rather needs to think about really framing itself in giving itself a framework of colonialism, or governing framework of colonialism, of governing within the colonialism rather of a special type. We know that we live with we're the only country rather where the colonizer shares a border or shares a boundary with the colonized. This is where the framing of colonialism of a special type comes in. So how do we then govern within this context, especially when the ANC literally in this moment had an opportunity not to do so? So the essence, however, of democracy and the breadth and volume of the strategy and tactics document, which is a document about the National Democratic Society that we envisage. The essence of democracy is about the continuous negotiation and renegotiation of power dynamics. And what I mean by that is that because Lefort is interested in power, how power is constructed more than what form that society takes. So how we construct power is the conversation that is important to Claude Lefort. And the ANC's National Democratic Society aligns to this because it mainly speaks to the transition from one society to another. So we moved from colonial apartheid to National Democratic Society Phase 1 to National Democratic Society Phase 2. What is interesting with strategy and tactics is that Chapter 5, the motive forces of the NDR, and this is it's not our most recent strategy and tactic, this is the 2012 one, speaks about the motive forces of the National Democratic Revolution, inclusive of the white community, because of the acceptance of a national constitution. It says the white community embraces non-racialism, thus it's not antagonistic to the National Democratic Revolution. And that's where we can locate it there. So why are we concerned with how society is constructed? Because it's the non-metaphysical nature of how we think constantly and consistently working in society and in the world that informs how we shape that world we want to exist in. So one can deduce from this idea that the fact that the people and the will of the people inform the social. So this is why Claude Lefort argues that the social has no constitutive foundation because it is shaped by how people think. And thinking in and of itself is an infinite form of interrogation. So what I'm saying is that some parts of South Africa are subject to abject poverty, right? And they would desire anything but democracy at the current state of things, because all they've known is just poverty. So democracy might not essentially work for them. So these are part of the groupings that inform those motive forces that we need to capture and inspire. So more about the white community in strategy and tactics. So it says that the ANC seeks to mobilize all South Africans to contribute to the ongoing transformation of our country. In doing this, we strive to appeal to and foster a common sense of South Africanness and a shared responsibility for a common destiny among all citizens, black and white. So mobilizing all South Africans is not only a strategic policy position of the ANC, but it also is a guiding principle around us having a shared responsibility. And this non-racialism idea, it goes as far back as 1955 in the Freedom Charter. And it says, we the people of South Africa declare for all our country and world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people, who are constantly interrogating the society they want to form. What is the strategy and tactics also saying in terms of the interplays of power when it comes to the white community as motive forces? So in essence, I think that strategy and tactics has prepared us for this moment that we find ourselves in. And it asks, who are the drivers of change? So it breaks down these groupings of the people whose will or vote we are after. We are chasing that will. We're constantly chasing them every time we go to elections, every time we write manifestos, every time we campaign. We shouldn't assume, though, and this is important, that they have an inherent revolutionary consciousness, and they will resolve to act in the collective interest. You know, this disclaimer is within the strategy and tactics. And strategy and tactics also asks, what about the various classes and strata within the white community? So it answers by saying, unlike during apartheid, they at least accept the imperatives of the national constitution, at the very least, as a minimum. And historically, we know that another way to think about this is that historically, the liberation movement characterized Africans in particular and blacks in general as the sole motive forces of the National Democratic Revolution. And they shall only remain as such to the extent at that day that the socio-economic legacy of apartheid continues to manifest in national terms. So there's a direct relationship between black people and so the socio-economic legacy of apartheid, the level of being progressive or not progressive. So you remove socio-economic legacy of apartheid, essentially, then black people stop being motive forces. Essentially, we're then reduced to equal beings of society, equal with the white community. Defined in class terms, these forces are made up of black workers, the employed, the unemployed, rural and urban intelligentsia, which is the black middle class black middle strata, as well as we also have the black capitalist group, whose emergence is quite limited because of their proximity to white capital. So this proximity to white capital is also a problem because it can be used as a tool to co-opt these black people, and they then degenerate into the comprador bourgeoisie, which we'll touch on later. Then, as part of the motive forces, we also have women in their various capacity, and then the NDR, or the strategy and tactics, then introduces the white communities who accept the national constitution. So across these circles of intertwining, and this is a quote directly, this is this quote in red here, saying that across these circles intertwining, the black and white interest taking shape with the definitions of the past starting to fade. As these circles intertwine and the currents across them flow into one another, so will the objectives of the NDR be reaching maturity. So the more we gel and come together as black and white, the more the NDR finds its true expression. So now let's talk about the ontology of the GNU. It starts with a statement of intent, which had about 17 versions. That's why when you read whichever version you have, you'll see that the one I have has final, final, final. So it was getting a lot of changes, and this just speaks to the environment at the time around these talks about talks. The DA, so when we talk about the contradictions, this ransom letter that we recently got from Helen Ziller, that was weird because it effectively had the DA calling for its own cadre deployment in the form of sitting in the appointments of the director generals. And then Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, responds by saying that it's constitutionally inconsistent. And then we also have Gayton McKenzie withdrawing from his non-negotiable of mass deportation in exchange for this portfolio that he's just been given. And then we also have Al Jamaa that interestingly wanted the deputy president position. And Al Jamaa is interesting because they constitute a very small voter share in Johannesburg, but with that small voter share, they enjoy the most significant position in Johannesburg as the executive mayor. And that's probably why the leader of Al Jamaa was so bold to want the deputy president position. But more on the makeup of the GNU. It's essentially a de facto coalition agreement, and it meets the requirements of having clauses on agreements and disagreements, as well as national priority focus, which essentially make up what a coalition agreement is. The long-term agenda, as Comrade Phoebe has already spoken about, is a compact, a social compact of common interests, and the next step for us is this national dialogue. So Clause 4 of the Statement of Intent, which is the coalition agreement, the people of South Africa, it says the people of South Africa expect us to work together to ensure what Clause 3 says. Clause 3 says, ensuring the stability and peace, tackling triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, and entrenching the Constitution and rule of law. Clause 8 then speaks to the fundamental principles, which among others include non-racialism and non-sexism, social justice, redress, human dignity and progressive realization of socio-economic rights, evidence-based policy and decision-making, professionalized government, integrity, good governance, and accountable leadership. So for me, or for us, what should be important is the last three, because these are paramount. Because the last three clauses of Clause 8 within in the Statement of Intent speak to a performance agreement. These are performance agreement clauses. And we can't have human dignity and the realization of socioeconomic human rights if we are not tracking their implementation. And an accountable leadership means transparency. So my suggestion is that this cabinet lekgotla that the ministers are about to have now, it must be broadcast. And the media must be invited, at least at this first one. The GNU needs to take South Africans into its confidence to see how they behave. So for us to see how they behave with one another. You know, the ransom letter, and then this letter, and then this letter, and then this letter. These people are tense. So their tension speaks to our tension as well, or creates our tension. And us being there, invited to see what that cabinet lekgotla, how it goes about its business, will ease our tensions, and potentially give us an opportunity to give inputs. Now we talk about the very problematic or very difficult question about the relation between the GNU and capital. Let me put it, if I were to put it simply like that. And I've titled this a comprador bourgeoisie moment, reflective of what the strategy and tactics constitutes as this black middle strata, or this black higher strata being close to white capital. So framing it as a question, is this a comprador bourgeoisie moment, and are we essentially killing Chris Hani again? I'd say we are, to the extent that socioeconomic transformation is delayed on the altar of narrow interests and co-option by white capital, and then we are, yeah. And what is white capital? That includes the rand, that includes the markets as well as other spooks, the string pullers, those behind the scenes spooks. Let's just frame them as that. We also know that the DA and the Freedom Front Plus are weak political parties in terms of ideology and diversity, as well as vote share. Yet, yeah, that 23%, yet they form part of this journey of ours. So it's back to that moment where we had an opportunity to say we don't need to necessarily work with these people. So how do we justify 23%? How do we justify a lack of ideology, a lack of diversity, and a small vote share? We also know that Steenhuisen is the man that said one man's genocide can be another man's freedom. And in terms of diversity, 6 ministers, only one is female in the DA. Only one of them is female. And some of them are matriculants. And then we also have the Freedom Front Plus wanting Oranje to be recognized. So that's the problematic of are we killing Chris Hani again? And it's also a question of to what extent. Now, it's one thing to say but it's another thing to believe in it. So what that essentially means is white people, we need white people to be accountable to ourselves. So if we can say that, it's fine. But if we believe it, is another thing, On the other opposite end of the spectrum, though, and this is important, we have these so-called black political parties that are not necessarily progressive. So we will kill Chris Hani if we don't fully commit to clause 8.3 in the statement of intent, which speaks to social justice, redress and equity, and the alleviation of poverty. The policy position of the GNU must rest on clause 8. It rests on it, but it must be reinforced. So every time they approach a cabinet lekgotla meeting, their starting point must be clause 8. And it's not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that the term conscientiously was trending recently. We need to understand that 2 ministers possess a matric. The Minister of Public Works and Infrastructure possesses a matric. The Minister of Agriculture only has a matric. So already this idea of conscientiously is problematized, because how do we allow ourselves to be led by matriculants? That's cynical of us and them to believe that that's what society wants. But the more general argument is that obviously it relates to white privilege, where less is demanded from the white community solely because equity in South Africa remains a challenge. So more about this comprador bourgeoisie moment and killing Chris Hani again. It says that we also need meritocracy and leadership, because once again, black parties or black people are not necessarily progressive. It's not an inherent thing. So clause 8 and 9 and clause 8.9 and 8.10 speak to these performance agreements. Another thing, step aside must be step aside. If you've stepped aside, go pay for your sins or clean yourself up, and then we can consider you again. Not go and then come back and be sworn in. So countries implementing the death penalty for corruption include China, North Korea, Iraq, Iran, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, Morocco, and Indonesia. What's our equivalent? In South Africa, we have lifestyle audits that either never take place or are never published if they do take place. And uh, the sad reality about corruption is that our economy could grow literally from dealing with systemic corruption. It threatens our constitutional democracy and economic development and stifles job creation and our prospects as an economic state. One economist told me that 30 to 40% of budget allocation from 2009 to 2017 didn't reach the people or municipalities. The budget was ranging between 1.3 trillion to 1.8 trillion. That means a minimum of 300 billion was lost per year. Essentially, our economy can grow just from dealing with corruption. And in the quote, Hani is essentially referring to this comparable bourgeoisie class. And if the GNU can't bring about economic transformation, then at a bare minimum, it must have real accountability and consequence management for corruption, malfeasance, pilferage, and maladministration. There was also a question in the chat about the supremacy of policies. I think that the policies of the GNU must be supreme. So when we talk about challenges with coalitions, firstly, coalitions in South Africa do work. In South Africa, we've witnessed that.
Sorry, Comrade Mpho.
Yeah.
Can I ask you to move with some speed as I'm looking at the time so that we can allow for discussions? Yeah.
Okay, sure. I think let me perhaps skip this slide and just maybe, yeah, because Comrade Phoebe already spoke about coalitions, but more on the interventions and mechanisms that can come from coalitions. Because of legislation, the president can be removed at any time depending on the stability of the GNU. And can we imagine a scenario where we have 5 different presidents and 5 different speakers in the next 5 years? So I'm contrasting this to Johannesburg, where we've had about 9 different mayors since 2016 and 3 different speakers since 2016. So right now we have a coalition bill at national and provincial levels, at local level, but we require one as well for national and provincial levels. Comrade Phoebe already spoke about the thresholds, but just to respond to Comrade Phoebe, perhaps I think thresholds should be there, because what happens when a small party lobbies itself to become a president, that is not representative. And then agreements should be made public and limits to motions of no confidence as well. So with regard to the 2026 outlook, I'm saying, I'm asking, what are we going to say to the potential voter? The NGC that you talk about in your paper, Comrade Gifense, needs to happen, and it needs to ventilate on this moment of fundamental consequence. And we need to talk about how almost half of registered voters, many of whom are from ANC strongholds, didn't vote. We also need to improve our PR machinery. And fortunately, the Secretary General has said in an article today that Lutuli House needs to be capacitated, and we need strategists in that office. We need planners, campaign specialists, lobbyists, and data analysts. But there also needs to be stricter controls on ANC membership. So heading towards this NGC, comrades need to write policy papers. What are our constant visits to China telling us? Why is the Chinese Communist Party so effective at managing 1 billion people? You know, what are they saying about criteria for joining, criteria for deployment? What are they saying about consequence management? I mean, I know in China, for you to join the Communist Party, you have to be recommended by a senior member of the Communist Party to join the party, not government. So there's a separate criteria for deployment, as well as a separate criteria for joining the Communist Party. Can we imagine that in the ANC? We must also understand that, and this is important for the national dialogue as well as this NGC, several MPs and MPLs have lost their livelihoods now with this recent election. And I think a total of about 114. And yet those positions, we know that those positions aren't guaranteed, but unfortunately this happened en masse, and we're talking about livelihoods here. So we need to probe how they are. How are these comrades, you know, and how do we regroup from that? It can't be business as usual. And then my parting thought, we now have evidence supporting Comrade Mbeki's assertion that the ANC is too big to fail. And this indicates that opposition parties struggle to organize themselves effectively outside the framework of the established by the ANC. And even though some people see 40% as a failure, we see it as an indicator of organizational renewal in full swing. The next 5 years will require resilience and adaptability as we navigate the complexities of transformation. Thank you, comrades and colleagues.
Thank you very much, Comrade Mpo, for that. Very insightful, provocative, and quite frank presentation, which I think allows us to start having frank and honest conversations about what this moment means to us. But thank you for the context that you have given in terms of your inputs, the theory of political science that you adopted from Lafort, as well as the comparative analysis that you've done at the beginning of your presentation, looking at what's happening in the rest of the world and how do we begin to make sense of the moment, taking a comparative analysis rather than being inward looking. So thank you for that presentation. Comrades, there you have it. Those were the two presentations, one from Comrade Phoebe Potgieter, the other one from Comrade Mpotladi. I think the presentations for me, they complement each other rather than disagree with each other. In fact, they allow us to delve deeper into this moment and start asking ourselves what are the real serious implications and how do we begin to deal with them. So I'm going to note hands, comrades, for you to ask questions. The rules of engagements are simple. One, your device must be named correctly. Number two, you have only 2 minutes to ask your question, and then I'll take 5 heads for the first round. And if we possibly can, we'll take the second round. I'll ask my guests if they can give us at least about 15 minutes more if they can, because really time is running against us. And I'll also ask my guests to go into the chat room. If there are any specific questions they want to respond to in the chat room, they can respond to them without me reading them out, because then that might chow into our time. So I'll note the first 5 heads. Please be straight to the point. No need for you to preamble or repeat what has already been said. And if you are covered, someone asked a question that you wanted, you just have to indicate that they have been covered. So I see the first head, comrades, is by Comrade Ishmam. I see that hand. Is there any other hand, comrades? I want to see all the hands. Ne? One, we have Comrade Ishmam. Any other hand, comrades? Please raise your hand so that we can take all of them. Comrade Zwelithini, Mkwena, Comrade Pumulani, Mbanya. Any other 2 heads, comrades? Comrade Lutando, Comrade Koshikaunda. Those are the first 5 that I'm going to take, comrades. Comrade Ishma, you can go ahead. I'll ask you to unmute. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, comrade. Thank you to our presenters, Comrade Phoebe and the other one. Very insightful, and I do think it covers broadly. You know, one area that I would like to zoom in, and let's say point that Comrade Phoebe raised in her presentation, the whole concept and prospect of renewal. In that respect, I think, the question we need to be asking ourselves is that we are currently in a GNU scenario. We need to ask ourselves whether we are, planning to remain in a GNU situation for the next 15, 20, 30 years, or if in perpetuity. I think if that is going to be our departure point, then I think we are largely conceding defeat. In that, we can never get to a point where we don't see ourselves as the majority party, a majority government representative of the people. So in terms of our strategy and tactics, and the reasons had been covered, fairly extensively in terms of what it is that actually drove voters, into either a state of apathy, or to, join up with other parties, and so on. I would want to believe that the main cause is that people have essentially lost, faith, trust, and confidence in the ANC. And if we are going to sort of change anything significantly, then it is that area that we need to be focusing on. Moving forward, in terms of organizational, renewal, there are elephants in the room that we simply refuse to acknowledge. We have to look very closely in terms of what our leadership structures are at the provincial level. I can only speak for what is happening here in the West. But somehow and somewhere along the line, if we are going to, restore faith, trust, and confidence with the electorate and inject the necessary capacity and skills and, in a way that would inspire confidence again with the electorate, then, we really need to be doing things differently and perhaps more decisively. To a point where I think we might even need to consider, where there are weak leadership structures.
Ishma, I think we get the point. I'm really running against time. I'm sorry to cut you, but I think that the point is driven across. Comrade Zwelithini, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Chair of the session. My question is around the two scenarios of positional base vis-a-vis the policy based. And I think when the president of BOSA was in the media, at some stage was asked to say that what we need to move forward, it's an agenda. For now, we haven't yet seen an agenda, but we are all out for position. Don't you see that this process is mixing water and oil? Because you appoint ministers who are actually, the JNU was interested in the positional base. You appoint people in the ministerial position to do what? Is there an agenda? I understand that after we will have the planned national Imbizo or nationally in Daba. What if we don't meet there in terms of policies? Because ANC is predominantly wanting to advance NDR, the emancipation of black people and in general, and Africans in particular. But I don't see TA and some other parties moving along those lines. Because if we don't set the agenda first before positions, this can be a recipe for disaster. Comrade Feb, you can maybe clarify us that if we don't meet eye to eye in terms of the national question, what is going to happen? Because it looks like we rushed to position before the national agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Zwelithini. I think your point is driven across. Comrade Pumla, I'm going to ask you to unmute and pose your question. Comrade Pumla, please unmute and ask your question. Sure.
No, thank you very much, comrades. Comrades, mine, it might not be that much a question, maybe a statement. Comrade, we are in a problem here that 2026, we are going for local government elections. And we saw the problems of how we lost our grounds in national government, meaning that one of them is an issue of service delivery to our people. Let's not run away from that one, because our people are sick and tired of our municipalities that are not delivering, are sick and tired of the corruption that they always hear on television and also see on their own local government. One, I just want to check if ANC do have power to really change our local government to where we are leading. Because when you are looking at the national election map, you will see that we are in big trouble. We can lose a lot of municipalities in coming elections. I will also suggest to say after that question to say that do we have all the resources or do we have all means to make sure that we do service delivery give service delivery to our people. Mine, comrades, we are not utilizing our alliances at all, comrades. For an example, with COSATU, we've got all these unions under COSATU who are affiliated to the federations. What are we doing with those unions? How are we making sure that, because they are just at the point of service delivery to our people, how come we cannot work closer to our unions who are in alliance with us to make sure that the service delivery goes to our people? People must make sure that as they work in government, they are there for the alliance as well. They are not just there for the sake of getting paid at the end of the month. No, thanks. Let me just leave it there, comrades. Thanks.
Yeah, I think your point is heard. I'm sorry, guys, I'm pushing against time, so I'll try to be as strict as possible. Comrade Noluthando, please unmute and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Comrade Noluthando, go ahead.
Thank you. It's Lutando. Quick one, Comrade. Thanks for the presentations. One, Comrade Phoebe, how should we interpret the more than 2.5 million voters that voted for your MKP, while we have consistently been working on getting rid of the notion of fighting corruption, while that party is full of those that were fingered in the Zondo Commission? I think that quagmire we must try to understand. The second one is the renewal process. Where do we see ourselves as the ANC in the next 5 years, especially in terms of electoral outcomes, finding ourselves in GNUs and in coalitions? How do we draft our fight back strategy while we are entangled in this coalition? Lastly, Comrade Mpo, I beg to differ on this notion of killing Christiania King. I think it fails to appreciate the moment and the quagmire that we're finding ourselves in, because I don't think anyone in the ANC is happy to be in any GNU. If it was up to all of us, we would be above 51%. But the reality and the challenges, as well explained by Comrade Phoebe, is that we could not just go to opposition while we are leading society. I think it's a misfortune. While we're finding ourselves in this, there are things that we can't control. That includes who political parties deploy in the GNU and who those characters whether they have matric, they have postgraduates, there's sufficient women representation and others. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Comrade Lutando. I'm sorry for the mispronunciation. I don't know why Lutando is on my tongue. But your questions have come across nicely. Comrade Koshi Kaunda, please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you, Comrade Chairperson of the session. Let me quickly welcome the presentation by the two comrades. Very fundamental presentations. And my question quickly, Comrade Chair, I'm not going to take too much of your time, only 30 seconds. Under the current conditions that we find ourselves as the ANC-led alliance, I'm very worried, but I will focus mainly on I think it was the second slide that Comrade Phoebe was presenting on, which said, how did we find ourselves here, or how did we come here? I didn't write it down. From 57% to 40%, Comrade Mukari, it's not a setback. It is a disaster. It's a catastrophe. And informed by that, I will say to Comrade Phoebe, as I said, I'm taking it from the question of that slide. How did we find ourselves here? I'm going to ask her to be very clear, very fundamental, very honest with her response on this question of are we running the organization correctly? Are we running the ANC well? Are we running the ANC strictly to follow on the principles and the policies of the ANC? Because I'm informed very clearly that the losses that we have suffered might be part of the issue that the branches which were supposed to be converted into BETs during the course of the elections were dysfunctional. Now, if the basic units of the organization are not functioning, how do we then expect ourselves to be successful in our campaigns for those elections? So my question, Comrade Chair, is, are we running the ANC as it is supposed to be run, strictly for us to be able to function correctly? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Koshi Kaunda, and all the comrades that pose questions. I will start with Comrade Phoebe, and then we'll go to Comrade Mpotladi. Depending on how quick they're able to respond to these questions, then we'll determine. Of course, with their permission, they will highlight if we can take the last round. We are also joined live on YouTube by comrades who are joining us through a live stream. They are also welcome to comment on anything that they feel is important. If there are any questions, I'll try to slot them in. Comrade Phoebe, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very. Can you, Comrade, hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, comrades.
Yes, you're audible.
I'm going to respond to the questions that were asked, as well as some of the questions on the group. There was a question about whether the supremacy of policies, whose policies will be supreme. Let me just say that firstly, the Government of National Unity is informed by its foundational principles, as well as the minimum program. So that provides a framework in which it will operate. And of course, the Constitution is supreme, and so is the laws of the country. You know, for example, somebody yesterday asked the question about the NHI. The president has signed it. So can it be changed and not be implemented? It can't. Even if you had a IFP or PA or whatever minister that didn't agree with the NHI, that is law. This is what the rule of law means. And I think that we've got a constitutional framework as well as a legal framework that very clearly points out, I mean, we've got 30 years of progressive policies. Yes, there are policies that we may want to introduce to accelerate economic transformation. We need to implement the public procurement act that was signed into power by the president. And this is part of why we need to make sure that we consolidate our position, and I think that one of the comrades referred to as the performance of the government of national unity, to be able to say, does it meet the requirements of social justice? Does it meet the requirements of redress, etc., etc.? Which brings me to a second issue about how the ANC will monitor and Alliance will monitor that. Comrades may recall, if you look at our manifesto, amongst the things that we said, and for the first time we have a section in the manifesto about implementing the manifesto, where we said that we will develop a performance system with our manifesto, and we will publicly report on those. I can't remember whether it's on a 6 months basis or quarterly basis or an annual basis. Now, what we've done is to look at the an outcome framework for the manifesto. So to be able to say, if we say that we want to, for example, as we said in our manifesto, we want to increase Black industrialists with a further 1,000, and ensure that all of them, you know, the 1,000 that we created in the first 5 years and the 1,000 that we created in the second 5 years, that they all play a significant role in the sector. What are the indicators that we use for that? And that is what the comrades that are in DTIC will have to implement, because that's the broad. If one look at the minimum program clause 8 that Comrade Paul referred to, those things are embedded there, and it needs to be public. We need to make sure, and that's why the SG spoke about the need for capacity at headquarters, but also working with Policy Institute, with universities, to be able to make sure that we monitor these issues. Comrade Paul raised this issue, and the question was also raised by Comrade, I think Comrade Zwelithini, about the fact that it seems as if the GNU is positional rather than ideological in our ministerial appointment, and how the national dialogue will fit in that to set the agenda. We see it as a two-pronged process. The first one is that we have committed all parties to the GNU and whoever comes in to be able to say that these are the foundational principles and this is the minimum program. So that's the first step on the basis of which SONA, the State of the Nation address of the president, will be, to be able to look at what did we say in that minimum program, but also what is in our manifesto, and then to be able to say how do we take it forward. The question about the national dialogue is to be able to bring society together broadly about determining what is the major challenges facing our country today, which is unemployment, poverty, and inequality, and how, as a society, labor, business, yes, indeed, capital, both black and white, your professionals, your civil society, and everybody come together, as well as political parties, come together to be able to then say that this is what we need to do as a minimum in the next 5 years to be able to move our country forward. And comrades should remember, and this is what we said in our manifesto, that the National Development Plan has two overarching priorities. The first one is to eradicate poverty, and secondly, to make significant progress with reducing inequality. So whether it's asset inequality, income inequality, or wealth inequality. Now, any program that we put in place, whether it's education, whether it is what happened to NSFAS, whether it is land reform, whether it's industrialization, must address the question about how does it contribute towards the alleviation and the eradication of poverty, and how does it contribute towards reducing inequality. So all of those are the overall things that we need to make sure that we fight for, as the Alliance, as COSATU, as the party, as progressive civil society within that. Because In the same way, comrades drew the parallel between 1994 and today. The reality is we went into a negotiations, but we didn't abandon the fact that you need to engage the people, that you need to reach out to civil society, that you need to make sure that you have strong structures that can do mass work so that people understand and they can be the defenders of progressive policies that government needs to push for. So I think that the next period is going to, because of this, and I think one comrades call it a catastrophe rather than a setback. I agree with you. It is the fact that we've gone a drop by 17% is a very serious setback, verging on a catastrophe. But what we had to do was to turn that around, and that is what we've done with the initiatives that the organization has taken. One comrade asked, where did we get the mandate to do that? The National Executive Committee, between meetings of conference, is the highest decision-making body, and that's the body that took the decision about the specific approach. There was a question about NKP and EFF. Comrades may recall that I said at the beginning that the mandate from the NEC that we must invite everybody to become part of the general government of national unity. We met with both parties. And they preferred not to be. The last party that we met, I think, was 2 days before the announcement of the cabinet, the EFF, and where we asked them, we've had 2 meetings with you where we put forward and extend this invitation. What is your response to it? So I think that the approach that we followed, we didn't exclude anybody. Because that was the mandate from the NEC, that we need to engage with anybody. We've met with all the parties, and those parties that didn't sign the SOI, it wasn't because we say you can't sign it. It was because they chose not to sign it and not to become part of the government of national unity. Comrades, I agree with the points that comrades raised about utilizing the alliance, because one of the realities, and I said it, how we got to this point, has got to do with the fact that we have not built a developmental state over the last 30 years. We have a state with developmental characteristics. If you look at our commitment towards the social wage, but a developmental state is not just responsible for a social wage. It's also responsible for making sure that you have an economy whose productive forces are developed, that are able to make sure that the issues of job creation, of ownership, of an inclusive economy are being addressed. Now, one of the things that we envisage in our manifesto was exactly that we need to build a developmental state that truly can address those issues. Which brings me to and I'm going to stop now and give to Comrade Mpho, which brings me to the question that was raised by Comrade Mpho in his conceptualization of the motive forces. And I'm not sure why he focused on the 2012 strategy and tactics rather than the latest strategy and tactics, because I think that our strategy and tactics is a dynamic document. Our strategic objective remained the same to the resolution of the basic contradictions of class, race, and gender, as a result of colonialism of a special type. That is at the core of what the ANC is about, and therefore the motive forces are defined in relation to that. I think that one of the issues of the review of the 2012 strategy and tactics and this redefinition of the motive forces was that it overstated the case to which during those first, I think it was 20 years, just shortly before 20 years, we have been able to resolve those contradictions. And in fact, the subsequent strategy and tactics in 2017 said that indeed we have not moved far to be able to say that you can then say that simply because white South Africans support the constitution, and I think the flag burning of the DA has raised a different set of questions, that necessarily you can therefore define them as part of the of the motor forces. Let me just finally say that Comrade spoke about the NGC. One of amongst the matters, which is also the organizational forms that Comrade spoke about as part of renewal, the ethical questions and step aside, how do we strengthen them towards the NGC, is the fact that the last time, I mean, and I've been part of every single strategy and tactics commission, I don't know, for the last 35 years. The last time we had a proper discussion on strategy and tactics was probably at the 2002 national conference. At all of the conference, the discussions tend to be divided along factions, and people are much more concerned about, who gets into the NEC, then having a discussion about what's happening to the motor forces, how do we define the motor forces, and therefore how do we define our tactics. And that is why the 55th National Conference said to us that in the lead up to the National General Council, we have to look at the motor forces, the character of the ANC, and all of those things that brought us to this moment where we have to make the kind of compromises that we had to make. Thanks a lot, Comrade Chair.
Thank you so much, Comrade Phoebe. But there was a question that was directed to you, specifically that said, "Are we running the party well?" I don't know if you can quickly comment on that before we move, because it was specifically directed to you. Sorry, Comrade Phoebe, I'll ask you to unmute just now. Sorry. This thing is not working with me. Yes, you can go ahead, Comrade Phoebe.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that clearly the answer is no. The quote from the Communist Party of China is that in order to run the country well, you have to run the party well and strictly. And I think that part of what we need to do towards the National General Council is to look at how do we, the organizational form of the ANC, how do we recruit members, how do we do political education, how do we deploy cadres, all of those issues, how do we organize different sectors. And I hope that we will be able to do that ahead of the NGC so that we can improve our performance towards 2026. The GNU should not be in perpetuity. The ANC must seek to become a majority party sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much, Comrade Phoebe. You'll indicate to me in the chat if you have an appetite for a second round and the time, because I know that you have a busy schedule. Comrade Mpo, you can go ahead and respond to some of the questions. You don't necessarily have to respond to what Comrade Phoebe has already responded to.
No, I need to respond to the SNT question statement Comrade Phoebe has just said. So I chose the 2012 SNT. Well, maybe let me say this. Comrade Phoebe, we know SNT is our Bible, and even the Bible has had many versions. So I chose SNT 2012 because I think fundamentally 12 years ago, it had this extraordinary foresight of framing the white community as part of the motive forces. So I just wanted to make that clear for Comrade Phoebe. There are many SNTs that we can refer to. And then to respond to Comrade Lutando, I think it's Comrade Lutando. Apologies if I'm getting the name incorrect. I framed the killing of Chris Hani as a question in comparison to, as opposed to what Comrade Banyaza did, which is framing it as a caution. He said, do not kill Chris Hani again. I'm asking, are we killing Chris Hani again? I was very intentional to do that because I don't want to make a statement. But the reason I'm doing this is because I'm not making a statement. I'm speaking on the symbolic meaning behind that. And here's why. Because of that particular quote that I'd shared there about the comprador bourgeoisie driving around with Mercedes-Benzes and being elitist. This is the current reality, and I framed in my presentation really deliberately the policy document from the ANC veterans that said we have politicians who are careerists and are solely in the ANC to elevate themselves, and they're elitist. But more than that, this kind of behavior is what perpetuates corruption. And if we're talking about 40% of our budget, not reaching its intended recipients, to the tune of that 1.8 trillion figure that was I was talking about, it underscores the urgent need for us driving a conversation about accountability on the one hand. So I'm not framing it necessarily as black or white people being competent or incompetent in the GNU. Competence needs to be black and white, regardless of whatever race you're from. So when we talk about this white privilege, we must critically examine the qualifications of those people, those leaders. Otherwise, GNU will repeat the mistakes of the past, essentially killing Chris Hani again. And how do we accept a minister who only has a matric, whether it's the DA minister or ANC minister? This raises significant questions about their capacity to lead. But in the DA instance, it speaks primarily about white systemic privilege, and that allows such appointments, as well as the gender question, because I spoke also about no diversity in the DA GNU ministers in this GNU arrangement. So the GNU, that's why I said at a bare minimum, if the GNU cannot bring about economic transformation, which is what it should, the main purpose of the GNU should be economic transformation to challenge inequity in South Africa and the triple threat that we spoke about, because this is fundamentally the reason for white privilege and regression from, and the deviation and the liquidation of what Comrade Phoebe was talking about, the prospects of the NDR. But I'm also saying that if the GNU can't bring about the economic transformation, at a bare minimum, it must ensure accountability, consequence management, as well as consequence management for corruption. Clause 8.9 and clause 8.10 in the statement of intent. Thanks, Kifens.
Thank you very much, comrades, for those responses. I will take last three hands, comrades, and I'll ask those hands to be very quick. There are already two hands. I'm adding one more, then we're closing it off. This is a very contentious discussion to have, and surely we won't have it at one go. So I will encourage comrades to actually have this discussion further going forward, and then we can then be able to digest it fully. So I'll take the last four hands that are raised, and then please be short to the point. The first one is Comrade John Ostruik. You can go ahead and pose your question.
Hi there. So first, can you hear me?
Yes, you are loud and clear.
Okay, good. All right. So I actually didn't want to post a question. So after the elections, I did an analysis of our previous results, and I did a previous analysis before the elections as well. And if you extrapolate the graph of our election results over the whole freedom period, it points directly to our current results. So it's a straight line graph. If you then overlay that with the graph of voter turnout, they're the same graph. It's the exact same graph. So my diagnosis is that our primary problem was low voter turnout, which was a result of us failing to deliver. That's all I want to say.
Thank you very much. Korten Bonda in Afrikaans, they would say. Thank you for that. Dr. Moloko, please go ahead and pose your question. Dr. Moloko, I've asked you to unmute. Yes.
Thank you very much, comrade. I was trying to unmute. I'll try very short. I will not repeat the questions that I put in the chat box, because I think that comrades will be able to see those, and part of them has been touched upon. Now, I would just like to comment on what many comrades are concerned about, which is the 2026 elections. There are proposals by comrades to say that instead of saying that we are going to the elections in 2026, what we should be saying is that maybe let's generate a private members motion where we extend the term of office of local government currently and call for what we call harmonized national elections, where local government, provincial government, and national government will all come together in 2029, because that will save us money. That will also result in a situation where we are not going to be using all the resources, having elections every 2.5 years. And at the same time, without saying it publicly, it would give us the opportunity of us being able to strengthen ourselves and come into an election having been able to go through what we are going through now. Now, on some of the points that Comrade Mpoy has mentioned, I find it a little bit uncomfortable when people are talking fewer but better. Isn't that just an expression that people are using in colloquial language that says mabahambe? And when we say mabahambe, let's bear in mind the fact that the opposition was not able to make any dent on the fortunes of the ANC. The ANC did not really perform that dismally, as some people are saying, because we have got 6 provinces where the ANC, in fact, has got a majority. But it is only because in 2 provinces that are the most populous, especially KZN and Gauteng, we have had that constituency of the ANC not being taken by the MK party, but being taken by one individual whose action was an expression of what is the cause of disunity, not in the ANC, but within the top leadership of the African National Congress. The last thing that I'm uncomfortable about is the manner in which Comrade Mpoy is talking about the white community embracing non-racialism, white interest versus black interest, because for me, these are the antithesis of the political position of the ANC, which is based on the agreement that South Africa's problems are based on race and class, and it is not a black versus white problem, and that the political line of the ANC is that of a united, non-racial, non-sexist, democratic, and prosperous South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moloko. Comrade Mekatekiso Kubai. You can go ahead and pose your question.
Thank you, Comrade. First is a statement, comment really. The government took certain steps, particularly around the economy and so on. Usually policy takes a little bit of time before it starts to bear fruit. Now, this fruit will be born perhaps in this term sometime. Now, I'm mentioning this because we're already starting to see the DA do things like posting statements. DA minister does this, DA minister does that, including a statement posted by a diplomat, I think in Germany, our German mission. DA minister does this with regards to work permits and so on. So they're going to claim, a lot of the work that was done by, ourselves in government. And we need to be awake, to that and, have a response to that. Perhaps maybe even, be preemptive, right? Now, the second question, the question I have is just for clarity. I think in one of Comrade Tladi's slides, I could have read it wrongly. It suggests that the DA does not have ideology. Perhaps I did not read it properly. If Comrade can clarify.
No, thank you very much, Comrade Mukatekiso. There are questions here. Well, a question and a comment from our YouTube viewers, and thank you very much for engaging. One is from Paul Buto, who's asking, will there be any advantage for the Western Cape with this government of national unity? And I guess this is based on the understanding that the agreement that is made on a national level, it's also cascading down to the provincial level, and we know the Western Cape, the DA there got the majority. So will there be an advantage for us being in opposition that now there is a national broader framework that we're using to work with, or the contexts are simply different? And then there's a comment also from Stephen Mukhomutsi Masilo, who says the current challenge of underperforming during the national and provincial elections, which led to the ANC not having the majorities, primarily because of the factions and not having the love for our people. And he makes a very bold statement. The people must go and read it for themselves so that I don't get into trouble, where he says the NEC must resign for these results. So these are the comments. I'll ask Comrade Phoebe to quickly respond to some and include her closing remarks. And we truly, truly apologize for keeping you longer than.
Thank you very much, comrades. No. I always have time to discuss ANC politics. I think that we all need to make more time for it. I agree with the comrades that made the point around voter turnout, because the reality is, comrades, we're talking about a national democratic revolution. And the democratic part of it is one of the things that's also in crisis as part of this 2024 moment, because the comrade says it's a problem of voter turnout, but it's more than a problem of voter turnout. We've got out of a population of about 62 million, we've got 40 million voting age population. Only about 27.8 million of them are registered, which means there's about 12 million people that not even part of the system to register. Then in addition to that, you've got a further 10 million that don't vote, even though they're registered. So you've got about 22 million people that don't vote, and then about 16.9% of them have voted. So we do have a serious democratic problem, and I think that is something which the ANC need to address, because the reality is that in opposition areas, so-called formerly white areas, voter turnout is about 77%. In ANC places where the ANC has a majority, voter turnout is about, on average, 58%. There's about quite a big difference. But if you then look at provinces where the ANC, even where we got a majority, Limpopo, Limpopo, Eastern Cape, Free State, Northwest, and Northern Cape, voter turnout is 51%, which means that 49% of people, even in our stronghold, even where we are the only party in town, didn't vote. So I think that comrades are correct. And we know from our research that there are three issues that voters are concerned about, whether they are ANC voters or whether they are undecided. The one is the economy, and that is jobs and the cost of living. The second one is corruption and crime. And the third one is basic services. So as we talk about how do we renew, how do we begin to rebuild and reclaim the ground, we must pay attention to those things. Otherwise, we're going to miss the plot. Comrades, the question about the implications for the Western Cape of the GNU. In provinces where a party won a majority government, there's no need to form a government of national unity, because you've got a majority, you've got a mandate to form a government. That's why the ANC formed a government in Limpopo, in Eastern Cape, in Mpumalanga, in Northwest and Free State, because we've got 51%. In the Northern Cape, we had 50% of the seats, and this is why we needed the support of other parties to be able to form a government and vote a legislation. So the implication of the DA having 55% in the Western Cape means that they form the government in the same way that we're forming a government in Limpopo, etc., etc. So I think that just that's just part of the reality. I think that, comrades, the point about disunity and factionalism, comrades, we've been talking about this for the last, 30 years, about the problem of factionalism, the challenge of disunity. And the reality is that we must accept as ANC members, as ANC leaders, that we can't carry on with things as it is at the moment. We have to take tough decisions. We need to be very firm about these issues, including what Comrade said earlier about our step aside regulations, about how do we communicate, about how do we monitor our programs, and also demand accountabilities from our own deployees, whether they're a councillor to a minister. We need to ensure that we have accountability and that we keep them, so that not just accountability, but also consequence management. Thanks a lot, Comrade Chair.
Thank you very much, Comrade Phoebe, and we really, really appreciate, the kind of passion and enthusiasm you have around issues that have to do with the African National Congress. We need more comrades like you who always who have time for the work of the organization. So we truly, truly appreciate your presence and taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. Comrade Paul, you can respond to the remaining questions, and please include your closing remarks.
Sure. I think Renewal has already siphoned a lot of members in the ANC, quality and not members that are not quality, for various reasons. And I'm going to make this point about this fewer but better, because it's not necessarily important for us to have an ANC with a huge membership, because that doesn't necessarily translate to quality output or quality outcomes in terms of voter share. And we see that with our 40% right now. In relation, of course, to bearing in mind, of course, to what John has said about the voter turnout. But I think fewer but better emphasizes a conversation about us enhancing our leadership quality and ensuring that we have the highest standards of leadership and government and governance in terms of the people we have in our organization. It's also a framing that speaks to us combating corruption and inefficiency. And one of the motivations is about us tackling internal issues that Comrade Phoebe just highlighted, and that I also spoke about that inefficiency, corruption, and factionalism. It also allows us to have a strategic focus, right, about training our cadres, and also focusing our resources strategically on nurturing and supporting this dedicated quality group that we are left with. I mean, let me ask a simple question, and given so you probably will know the answer to it. We have a Ruth First Institute that's supposedly supposed to be up and running right now, with cadres and comrades that are supposed to be essentially getting trained in this, but nothing's been happening with that. And then, in terms of also the ORTSoL School of Leadership, how many comrades have genuinely taken those courses and gotten certificates? So we need to know the quality and the type of membership that we have as an organization. And this is not something I'm introducing once again. It's also about being outward looking, this fewer but better, and rebuilding public trust. Our credibility has taken a hit because of scandals, because of governance failures. So this fewer but better is at least at an aerial or optic level, in terms of optics and our PR. And the DA is very good at PR. This fewer but better approach signals a serious intent of reform and placing South Africans' national interests above our own inward lookingness. And this is a direct response to this existential framing by our policy documents in 2022. And it also speaks to inclusivity and representation. So this approach, yes, Comrade Confi is right, it might marginalize certain members, but it is important that we drive quality in a way. It must be managed in a way that it doesn't compromise inclusivity and diversity, and us actually trying to get more people to join the ANC. So in terms of placing whiteness in this current discussion, I think I've already alluded to why I spoke about the 2012 SNT as opposed to the 2017 strategy and tactics, is because of that the way it fundamentally frames the white community, not in isolation. It's in relation to other motive forces that are drivers of change. And it also makes clear that it does not assume that they are inherently progressive. So 2012, in terms of answering the question for me on white people as motive forces, it is enough to justify our relationship in the GNU with white political parties, in inverted commas. And then there was someone that asked me, I'm sorry, I forget your name, that asked me about the DA's ideology. The DA embraces a literal liberal conservatism and free market fundamental ideology. So there is an ideology, but the point I'm making is that it's weak. DA's ideology is weak in responding to domestic and global issues. Domestic, they want to do away with the NHI, broad-based Black economic empowerment. Land is not even an issue. It's not even in the question for them. Essentially and effectively countering the gains of the National Democratic Revolution. Where does that leave the ideology? It's weak. And I'm capturing the point in the statement that the leader of the Democratic Alliance literally says in the middle of a genocide that one man's genocide can be another man's freedom. So for me, you can't say that the DA has an ideology.
Thank you very much, Comrade Paul, for also taking time out of your precious hectic schedule to be with us today, for the presentation that you gave us, and we hope that it won't end here. Thank you as well to Comrade Phoebe once again. Thank you to everyone who has actually taken time out of their schedules to be with us today. It's on a Sunday. I know some would rather be at church, be busy with this and that, spend time with family, but you chose to make time for us, and we truly appreciate it. Thank you for all the questions that were posed, the engagements that were had, including in the chat group, as well as comrades that have been joining us on YouTube. We decided to do a live on YouTube because people have been complaining that some of them are not on Facebook. But we'll try to actually stream on both platforms to ensure that we can be as inclusive as we possibly can. What we take away from this conversation is that, one, we can never have enough time to fully exhaust the extensiveness of this particular conversation. But secondly, this moment, in as much as it's a moment of fundamental consequence that is loaded with challenges in terms of how we govern and how we do things as a political party, there are also opportunities that are presented. And key amongst them is that this moment presents us with an opportunity to expedite renewal and ensure that our organization is geared up to deal with these realities. And I like what Comrade Phoebe said, that there hasn't been a sufficient conversation to review our strategy and tactics. And I guess this is the moment, and hence the need to have that particular NGC, and I think taking also into consideration the context that Mpho gave, showing us what is happening all over the world. We then have an opportunity to also assess the balance of forces even on a global level, so that whatever strategy and tactics that we come up with as a review of the current one are able to speak to present day challenges. So we'll be having other discussions in the context of some of the things that came up today. One of the things that we have a keen interest in as the school is a thorough assessment of what this electoral outcome is telling us. what are we seeing from the numbers? What are they saying? And how should we respond to those numbers? Not within the context of the GNU, but in the broader context. So stay tuned on all of our social media platforms to see what conversation we'll be having next and with who. So we'll see you next week, same time, same platform.